Καλησπέρα σας. Good evening. Μετά τη μεσημεριανή παύση, επαναλαμβάνονται οι εργασίες του συνεδρίου. Είμαι ο Νίκος Xydakis, δημοσιογράφος, αρθρογράφος στην Kathimerini και έχω την τιμή να διευθύνω αυτό το session, αυτή τη συνεδρία, χάρη στην ευγενική καλοσύνη του Ινστιτούτου Levy και του Προέδρου του Δημήτρη Παπαδημητρίου, που με κάλεσε και κάλεσε βέβαια και όλους τους ανθρώπους που συμμετέχουν στα τραπέζια, στις συνεδρίες. Σήμερα η σημερινή συνεδρία είναι αφιερωμένη στη σχέση της εργασίας και της ανάπτυξης με το ευζήν, με την ευτυχία. Είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα αυτή η λέξη που χρησιμοποιείται, το well-being. Εγώ θα το απέδιδα στα ελληνικά ως ευζήν και κατ' επέκταση ως ευτυχία, διότι επαναφέρει στο επίκεντρο της συζήτησης αυτής για την οικονομική κρίση τον βαθύτατο πολιτικό και ηθικό πυρήνα. Δεν είναι απλώς τεχνική συζήτηση, δεν είναι απλώς οικονομία, είναι μια συζήτηση για τα θεμέλια των ανθρώπινων κοινωνιών, για τις προσδοκίες και τα όνειρα των ανθρώπων, για τις αξίες που εμπνέουν τις ζωές τους και για τις αξίες και τα θεμέλια της ίδιας της δημοκρατίας. Νομίζω ότι από την πίσω πόρτα αυτός ο προσφύης τίτλος βάζει όλα τα μεγάλα κείμενα του ανθρώπινου πολιτισμού και ίσως τα πιο κοντινά στους νεότερους χρόνους, στο δικό μας ιστορικό ορίζοντα, να είναι η περίφημη η διακήρυξη της Αμερικανικής Ανεξαρτησίας, με την οποία θεμελιώνεται ως δικαίωμα το δικαίωμα στην ευτυχία. Και ακόμη πιο κοντά, σε έναν στοχαστή που έχει επηρεάσει πολλούς από τους οικονομολόγους και τους πολιτικούς στον 20ο αιώνα, ο Κέινς υποστήριξε ότι από τον 21ο αιώνα και μετά θα μπορεί οι άνθρωποι με λογική διαχείριση των πόρων, του πλούτου, να προσεγγίσουν την ευτυχία. Το 2013 όμως, οι οικονομολόγοι που έρχονται από όλες τις μεριές του κόσμου για να συζητήσουν στην Αθήνα, συζητούν με άλλους όρους και από την σκοπιά των εδώ ανθρώπων που υποφέρουν, πρέπει να πω ότι είναι εξαιρετικά σημαντικό αυτό το συνέδριο, γιατί ανοίγει τη δημόσια συζήτηση σε ατραπούς και σε επιχειρηματολογία που στηρίζουν την πολιτική ουσία και τη δημοκρατία και αποθεμελιώνουν με επιχειρήματα αυτή την δυσιδαιμονία που επικρατεί στην πολιτική και οικονομική σκέψη, αυτό το περίφημο «there is no alternative». Είναι αυτά που επαναλαμβάνουν οι αξιωματούχοι της Ευρωπαϊκής Κεντρικής Τράπεζας, των Βρυξελών, της Φραγκφούρτης, του Βερολίνου συχνά, ότι υπάρχει μόνο μία θρησκευτική δοξασία που διέπει όλες τις ανθρώπινες σχέσεις στη δημόσια σφαίρα, πίσω από την οποία όμως πλέον, όταν εκατοντάδες εκατομμύρια Ευρωπαίοι πολίτες υποφέρουν και όταν κράτη ολόκληρα κλονίζονται οι υποστάσεις τους, διαπιστώνουμε ότι υπάρχει μια προφανής πολιτική δολιότητα και ότι πίσω από όλο αυτό είναι το αιώνιο παιχνίδι της κυριαρχίας. Αυτό που βλέπουμε λοιπόν, εγώ προσωπικά, είναι μια ολομέτωπη επίθεση μιας corporate νεοφεουδαρχίας, η οποία απειλεί όλες τις κατακτήσεις των εθνών κρατών από την αυγή της δημοκρατικής νεωτερικότητας από τον 18ο αιώνα έως σήμερα. Υποδέχομαι λοιπόν με πολύ μεγάλη χαρά τους συζητητές σε αυτό το πάνελ για να συζητήσουν τα ζητήματα αυτά για την εργασία ως δικαίωμα, για το ευζήν ως δικαίωμα και όχι μόνο ως δικαιώματα, αλλά ως υπαρξιακά, συστατικά στοιχεία συντεταγμένων κοινωνιών και δημοκρατιών. Πρώτος στη σειρά, ο καθηγητής Terrence McDonough από το Εθνικό Πανεπιστήμιο της Ιρλανδίας, από μια χώρα, από ένα έθνος το οποίο έχει περάσει παρόμοια βάσανα με εμάς και βρίσκεται σε μια κατάσταση σκέψης, αναπροσδιορισμού, προβληματισμού. Professor McDonough.
To some extent, my presentation today is, in fact, on the well-being of the Irish nation and the prospects for that well-being into the future. But I think it's particularly important in a forum like this to emphasize the case that Ireland is not really an effective poster boy for austerity. And that's going to be the main thrust of my presentation here today. Ireland's colonial history has meant that it has felt the loss of its economic sovereignty keenly, but at the same time it has instinctively understood the deference that's expected of the colonial subject. And one need only look at Irish politicians on the European stage today to see this. They're very anxious to meet all the targets that are set, and of course they're very happy to take the opportunity to blame faceless Troika bureaucrats for the politically dangerous consequences of enthusiastically applying austerity. If it weren't for the Troika, they would probably be doing much the same thing, but without the cover. The rationale for this is very much TINA. That is, there is no alternative. There is no alternative is a genuine intellectual conviction of the Irish policy elites, and this includes politicians of several party affiliations, including Labour, most economists, and most media commentators. TINA does, however, have several alternative rationales in Ireland. There's the original Thatcherite version, under which shrinking the state is a good thing in itself. In another version, emphasizes Ireland's position as a small open economy and argues that proactive economic policy in this context is simply impossible. And this is especially true when a state does not control its own currency. The only option from this perspective is to balance the budget, re-enter the financial markets, and hope for export surpluses to drive the recovery. Underlying this is the notion that a capitalist economy tends to restore itself automatically to a full employment equilibrium. Best to get the cuts over quickly, restore confidence, and allow this basic process to work. Oops. This soup of conservatism ultimately boils down to defining policy success as meeting the targets and returning to the markets. And if this was the only criterion of success, Ireland indeed is best in show among the pigs. That is, of course, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. Ireland has succeeded in both meeting its targets and paving a way for the return to the markets. While the deficit target for 2011 was not met, the target for 2012 was exceeded. The outturn this year, 2013, may miss the target by a small amount. You've got that on the top line there. There is no trouble expected in meeting the 2014 target of 5.9 billion. It's thought that this is the last of the austerity budgets, and in fact, it's cut a bit less at 2.5 billion than was originally planned. Ireland's long-term interest rates have indeed returned to manageable levels, though if you go back just a little over a year or so, they were way above it So it's not something which has been sustained for very long, but there it is. We can look forward to an orgy of political self-congratulation upon Ireland's exit from the bailout, which is currently scheduled for December 15th. Both the claim of economic success and the celebration of the return to Irish sovereignty will surely be premature. Just a little illustration there from Animal Farm and George Orwell. A broader examination of the state of the Irish economy tells a different story. First, the performance on the fiscal deficit has to be compared to the fiscal effort which was put in by the government. The total fiscal adjustment has been close to 29 billion euro, or 17% of GDP so far. Headline deficits over the same period have fallen only by 5.4% of GDP. So we've spent 29 billion to get a fall of 5.4. This figure actually falls to 4.6% if the effects of the banking crisis are stripped out. That is, the Irish government actually receives some income at the moment from the banking crisis. Oops, there we go. Got to hit the right button and point it in the right direction. These deficits are reflected, of course, in the expanding character of the government debt. You can see that the government debt was quite low prior to the onset of the crisis and has now broken about 125% of GDP. Of course, the GDP has been declining. The GDP dropped by over 9% from 2007 to 2010. The GNP, an alternative measure, fell by 12% from 2007 to 2011. At the moment, well, at 2012, the GDP remains over 7% below its 2007 level. It's important, of course, to look primarily at the employment situation because this is the arena in which the actual decline in economic activity hits the ordinary Irish citizen. This is the unemployment rate. We had a question earlier about U6. The unemployment rate, including underemployed, is that top line, the dotted line, and it basically indicates that unemployment is hit about 25%, that is 1 person in 4 in the Irish workforce. There have been recent falls in headline unemployment, small falls of about 1%, but as you can see from the graph, they're roughly compensated by increases in other forms of unemployment. The unemployment figures would be higher if it were not for high levels of emigration. Just a bar chart showing the increasing levels of emigration. This is a venerable Irish strategy for dealing with economic distress. Of course, this is predominantly younger people, although it's affecting older and older people as well. All of this means that the unemployment rate is underestimated. One way of including factors like immigration is to look at trends in the workforce and numbers at work. The labor force, you can see, has been falling since 2007, and so has the number in employment. Another way of looking at this is the number of unemployed persons per job. Here, Portugal and Cyprus are making Ireland look better than it should. Ireland is still very much at the bottom of the table, with over 32 people looking for every job opening. Long-term unemployment has been tracking the overall level of unemployment. Irish youth unemployment is still rising. Poor employment prospects and pressure on public sector wages have resulted in an overall decline since 2009 in average earnings. At the same time, poverty rates have risen. The decline in average earnings has distorted the usual measure of the poverty rate. The one I want to emphasize here is the red line. The red line measures deprivation. That is, can you concretely not afford two of the necessities of life? A warm coat, a second pair of shoes, meat once or twice a week, etc. And you can see that this deprivation rate is now pushing, again, one person out of four of the population. Of course, all of this has macroeconomic effects. There's the volume of retail sales. This is supposedly the green shoot there at the end. But in fact, the volume of retail sales just oscillates up and down and has been doing so since 2008. We've already discussed declines in government expenditure. There's gross fixed domestic capital formation, investment, roughly speaking, maybe bottoming out, but perhaps still falling. Here's domestic demand as a whole. It's also important to consider the question of debt and finance. This is debt held by Irish households as a percent of disposable income. That's the black line here. You can see that in 2003, it started out at about 25%, extraordinarily low, and then has risen rapidly to 200, what is this percentage of this? Yeah, over to about 220% of disposable income. Lately, there's been some deleveraging, but it's an extraordinary set of figures. We've seen through the fall in housing prices, about 50% from their peak, the accumulation of negative equity, extremely high, about 65% of houses underwater. And along with that, the accumulation of mortgage arrears. You've got about over an 80% rate of housing ownership, so that when you talk about mortgage arrears hitting about 25% of mortgages, it's a little bit under, you're talking about an incredibly large number of people. The bulk of the mortgages in arrears, which is the blue segment here, are in arrears for over 3 months, in excess, actually no, not 3 months, 6 months, arrears in excess of 180 days, accounting for the bulk. The impact of this on local financial institutions and lending into the economy is predictable. This is the trends in credit advanced in the Irish private sector, going negative in 2009 and staying negative. That is, every year, every month, less is lent out than the month before. In the light of these figures, and this is the interesting question, what are the future prospects for the Irish economy? And here we need to look at the shape of the downturn, the shape of the so-called recession. And what's traditionally done, or at least traditionally in the last few years, is to talk about it in terms of what letter of the alphabet is the shape of the recession. The most optimistic letter is V. That is, you have a very sharp recovery following a very sharp downturn. Well, it's already too late for that. The next possible shape is a U. The U is what I think the authorities, or maybe mainly politicians, would like people to believe. That is, a lot of these figures, though some of them are still falling, appear to be bottoming out. So that the green shoots, perhaps right here, indicate that the economy is going to be rapidly recovering. But in actual fact, there is no analyst which actually believes in that U-shaped recovery. I want to just direct you to a very interesting study by the European Commission. It's the Economic Policy Committee in European Commission. You can Google it. It's the 2012 Aging Report. Okay, what this is attempting to do is say something about the so-called pension crisis. You know, the point at which the future will have to let all the old people starve because there aren't enough young people to provide them with pensions. So they need to look at things like unemployment rates in the future in order to say something about pension affordability in the future. This particular study projects an Irish unemployment rate of 13.4% in 2020. It will take 5 years to 2025 to fall to 10%. It is 2030 in this study before the Irish unemployment rate starts to even approach the projected German rate in 2030. Okay, remember the business cycle. It hasn't gone away, you know. So sometime between now and 2030, there's going to be another downturn. The upshot of this is that Irish employment is not expected to recover ever. What I want to argue in conclusion is that the reason for the crisis which we're all facing is epochal. That is, we're in an economic crisis of historic proportions. This economic crisis is not an ordinary business cycle downturn. Okay. It's a structural crisis. And it's a nested crisis, and after the last 2 days, I don't have to emphasize this too much here. What we've got going in Ireland is an Irish crisis. If I had more time, I could talk about that in some detail. But the Irish crisis is nested within a European crisis, which has been much the subject of this week's conference. And the European crisis is nested in a crisis of global neoliberalism. There have been historical precedents for this, historical antecedents, one of which is the long depression of the late 19th century, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Great Stagflation of the 1970s, and we're now facing what's most often called the Great Recession at the start of the 21st century. I would argue that the cause of the long depression was the crisis of competitive capitalism in the 19th century. The response, monopoly capitalism, which temporarily resolved the crisis of competitive capitalism. The Great Depression was in its turn the crisis of monopoly capitalism resolved by Keynesian capitalism. The Great Stagflation, the crisis of Keynesian capitalism resolved through global neoliberalism. The Great Recession, which we're facing now, is the crisis of global neoliberalism. Response, more global neoliberalism. Okay, what's wrong with this picture? This is essentially very much what we're facing in Ireland, sometimes referred to by its opponents actually as Plan A. Cut wages, eliminate labor protections, cut social services, sell state enterprises, shrink public employment, restrict the money supply, at least in relation to what's needed, and then rely on export surpluses to get out. The upshot of this is going to be not a V, not a U, not the dish shape that's been officially predicted. The upshot of this is going to be an L-shaped downturn. And yes, Ireland may be turning a corner, but it's this corner here. Okay, there is no prospect in any of the figures that I've shown you so far of recovery unless you assume that economies always expand after hitting the bottom. But that's, of course, to assume what needs to be proven. This is a statistical picture of the L. Annual GDP growth, annual GNP growth, both of which are necessary to think about Ireland because both of them are heavily distorted by the activities of multinationals. That's the bottom of the L there, and the first couple of years of its future trajectory, I would argue. That's the Minister for Finance, Michael Noonan. Upon assuming office in 2010, the first thing he said he would do was have T-shirts printed up. So there's the T-shirt. That's what he was going to print on them. Ireland is not Greece. Or is it? I think there's the Greek L. Ireland is very much Greece. It's the same letter. It's just perhaps a different point on the PowerPoint slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Με πολλά στοιχεία και αρκετό πικρό χιούμορ, που είναι όμως ένα από τα πιο αποτελεσματικά εργαλεία για να δούμε και να σκεφτούμε σε βάθος. Ο λόγος στην κυρία Λούκα Κατσέλη να μας φέρει από την Ιρλανδία στην Ελλάδα.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Και ήθελα να πω στον κύριο McDonough ότι ή μιλούσε για την Ιρλανδία ή μιλούσε για την Ελλάδα. Περίπου η ίδια κατάσταση είναι και αυτό που του είπα φεύγοντας, συγχαίροντάς τον, ήταν ότι ελπίζω ότι είναι ένα λάμδα και όχι ένα S αγγλικό, διότι πολύ φοβάμαι ότι μακροχρόνια, τα επόμενα 10 χρόνια, η μετανάστευση, η μείωση της παραγωγικότητας, η μείωση των επενδύσεων θα οδηγήσει σε πολύ χειρότερες καταστάσεις. Ποια είναι τα βασικά μηνύματα? Αποφάσισα να κάνω το PowerPoint στα αγγλικά για τους ξένους και να μιλήσω ελληνικά, έτσι ώστε να έχουν και εκείνοι μια οπτική παράσταση της παρουσίασής μου. Ουσιαστικά 3 είναι τα μηνύματα της ομιλίας μου. Το πρώτο μήνυμα είναι ότι η πολιτική της βίαιης λιτότητας έχει αποτύχει ικτρά σε όλες τις χώρες που έχει εφαρμοστεί, με μεγάλο οικονομικό, κοινωνικό και πολιτικό κόστος. Το δεύτερο μήνυμα είναι κάτι το οποίο δεν το συζητάμε και δεν έχει αναδειχθεί στο δημόσιο διάλογο, ότι ένα μεγάλο μερίδιο ευθύνης για αυτή την αποτυχία, πέρα από την δημοσιονομική πολιτική και την πολιτική της εσωτερικής υποτίμησης, ή αν θέλετε την αποτυχία της μείωσης του χρέους, έχουν οι ονομαζόμενες μεταρρυθμίσεις, μέσα σε εισαγωγικά, ή τα διαρθρωτικά μέτρα. Συνήθως, στο δημόσιο διάλογο, όλοι λέμε ότι τα διαρθρωτικά μέτρα, οι μεταρρυθμίσεις είναι καλές. Αυτό που θέλω να δείξω και να τονίσω είναι ότι οι μνημονιακές μεταρρυθμίσεις, έτσι όπως έχουν γίνει, είχαν είτε δημοσιονομικό σκοπό, είτε πελατειακούς σκοπούς και τελικά έχουν οδηγήσει σε μεγαλύτερη ύφεση και μεγαλύτερα προβλήματα. Και το τρίτο μήνυμα, το τρίτο συμπέρασμα της ομιλίας μου, θα είναι ότι η χώρα μπορεί να βγει από την κρίση. Υπάρχει εναλλακτική. Αλλά γι' αυτό χρειάζονται αναπτυξιακές και όχι πελατειακές ή δημοσιονομικές μεταρρυθμίσεις, που θα στηρίξουν ένα εναλλακτικό σχέδιο ανασυγκρότησης, δηλαδή την παραγωγική ανασυγκρότηση της χώρας, στο πλαίσιο μιας συνεκτικής πολιτικής απομείωσης του χρέους και συγκράτησης της εγχώριας αγοραστικής δύναμης. Και θα καταλήξω με μια μεγάλη προϋπόθεση, ότι για να γίνουν αυτά πρέπει να υπάρξει μεγαλύτερη διαφάνεια, μεγαλύτερη λογοδοσία και τελικά να σπάσει αυτό που κάποιοι από εμάς ονομάζουμε ένα κλειστό κύκλωμα εξουσίας. Και θα δώσω κάποια παραδείγματα, διότι συμφωνώ απόλυτα με αυτό που ελέγχθη πριν, ότι πέρα από μια οικονομική κρίση έχουμε και μια βαθύτατη ηθική κρίση που είναι στα θεμέλια της οικονομικής πολιτικής. Οι πολιτικές της λιτότητας έχουν αποτύχει. Ο πίνακας αυτός είναι ένας συνοπτικός πίνακας. Η Ελλάδα είναι εδώ. Δεν ξέρω πώς ανοίγει αυτό. Έχουμε βασικά ύφεση σε όλες τις χώρες. Έχω τα στοιχεία του 8 και του 12. Η ύφεση βαθαίνει σε όλες τις χώρες. Στην Ελλάδα από μείον 0,2% το 8 στο μείον 6,4%. Αυτό το ξέρουμε. Ο κ. McDonough έδειξε όλα τα στοιχεία για την Ιρλανδία. Το ίδιο γίνεται σε όλες τις χώρες. Το πιο ενδιαφέρον είναι ότι ο λόγος χρέους προς ΑΕΠ, που υποτίθεται ότι όλο αυτό το πείραμα γίνεται για να μειωθεί το χρέος, έχει αυξηθεί υπέρμετρα σε όλες τις χώρες. Μεταξύ 8 και 12, δεν έβαλα τα στοιχεία του 13, είναι ακόμα χειρότερα, αλλά είμαστε στη μέση του έτους, ο λόγος χρέους προς ΑΕΠ έχει αυξηθεί παρά το PSI, παρά την απομείωση του χρέους. Στην Ελλάδα το 2013 θα ξεπεράσει το 175%. Ο κ. McDonough έδειξε τα ακριβή στοιχεία για την Ιρλανδία για το έλλειμμα της γενικής κυβέρνησης. Παρά τις μεγάλες περικοπές, το έλλειμμα της γενικής κυβέρνησης σχεδόν σε όλες τις χώρες έχει αυξηθεί. Και τέλος, το ποσοστό ανεργίας έχει διπλασιαστεί ή τριπλασιαστεί στις περισσότερες χώρες. Και στη χώρα μας ξεπερνάει το 24% το 12, έχει φτάσει στο 30% σχεδόν το 2013 και στους νέους είναι περίπου πάνω από 55%. Τι γίνεται με την ανταγωνιστικότητα? Μας λένε ότι χρειαζόταν η μείωση των μισθών για να βελτιωθεί η ανταγωνιστικότητα. Η ανταγωνιστικότητα, έτσι όπως τη μετράμε οι οικονομολόγοι, έχει χειροτερεύσει. Ποιος είναι ο δείκτης που χρησιμοποιούμε στα οικονομικά? Είναι ο δείκτης αυτό που λέγεται, φαίνεται να ακούγεται τεχνικό για μερικούς, η σταθμισμένη πραγματική ισοτιμία. Δηλαδή, πόσο κοστίζουν σε ξένο συνάλλαγμα τα δικά μας προϊόντα σε σχέση με τα προϊόντα των άλλων, των τρίτων. Λοιπόν, εάν μετρήσεις την ανταγωνιστικότητα όχι στη βάση του μοναδιαίου κόστους εργασίας, αλλά στη βάση των τελικών τιμών, η ανταγωνιστικότητα σε όλες σχεδόν τις χώρες έχει χειροτερεύσει. Και πώς το βλέπουμε αυτό? Το βλέπουμε ακριβώς από την δεύτερη, εδώ από αυτό τον πίνακα, όπου αυτός ο δείκτης έχει αυξηθεί για όλες τις χώρες και από την Ελλάδα από το 104 περίπου, που είναι ο δείκτης, έχει φτάσει στο 111%. Δηλαδή, τι λέμε? Ότι τα δικά μας προϊόντα στις ξένες αγορές έχουν γίνει πιο ακριβά από ό,τι ήταν σε σχέση με τα ξένα προϊόντα. Παρά την μείωση του εισοδήματος αναεργαζόμενου που είναι στην πρώτη κολόνα. Άρα, η τιμολογιακή ανταγωνιστικότητα έχει χειροτερεύσει. Θα σας εξηγήσω γιατί. Και είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρον. Ποιος είναι ο άλλος δείκτης σημαντικός ανταγωνιστικότητας, ιδίως μακροπρόθεσμης ανταγωνιστικότητας? Τι γίνεται με τις επενδύσεις? Και υποτίθεται ότι όλο αυτό το εγχείρημα έχει γίνει για να τονωθούν οι επενδύσεις. Σε όλες τις χώρες, αλλά και κυρίως στην Ελλάδα, οι επενδύσεις παγίου κεφαλαίου ως ποσοστό του ΑΕΠ έχουν πέσει δραματικά. Κατά 10 και περισσότερες ποσοστιαίες μονάδες, περίπου 9 κάτι στην Ελλάδα. Τι έχει βελτιωθεί? Το ισοζύγιο τρέχουσών συναλλαγών, η τελευταία στήλη. Αλλά αυτό είναι κυρίως λόγω της ύφεσης, λόγω της μείωσης των επενδύσεων και επομένως η μείωση της ζήτησης έχει προκαλέσει ένα πλεόνασμα ή μια μείωση του ελλείμματος στο ισοζύγιο τρέχουσών συναλλαγών, στις εξωτερικές μας συναλλαγές, το οποίο όμως δεν είναι βιώσιμο και δεν είναι διατηρήσιμο εάν αρχίσει η ανάκαμψη. Γιατί, για να μπω στο σημείο που θέλω να εστιάσω την προσοχή μου, στα διαρθρωτικά μέτρα και στις διαρθρωτικές μεταρρυθμίσεις, γιατί χειροτέρευσε η ανταγωνιστικότητα? Πώς εξηγείται αυτό? Εξηγείται από 3 παράγοντες, που είναι ενδιαφέρον. Ο πρώτος είναι ότι η υπέρμετρη αύξηση της έμεσης φορολογίας πέρασε στις τιμές. Η έμεση φορολογία στην Ελλάδα αύξησε τον τιμάριθμο και έδωσε περίπου κατά 70%. Και στον πίνακα αυτόν που έχω πάνω, δεν είναι ανάγκη να μπούμε στις λεπτομέρειες του, μπορείτε να τον δείτε μετά όταν θα αναρτηθεί στο διαδίκτυο. Εάν μετρήσεις τον πληθωρισμό, έχουμε μεταξύ του 8 και του 12 στην Ελλάδα, βλέπετε ότι οι τιμές από 111 περίπου το 8 πήγε στο 123 τελικές τιμές. Εάν αφαιρέσεις την έμεση φορολογία, η αύξηση είναι σχετικά μικρή. Άρα, ένας λόγος για τους οποίους η τιμολογιακή ανταγωνιστικότητα της χώρας χειροτέρευσε είναι ακριβώς διότι είχαμε μια πολύ μεγάλη αύξηση της έμεσης φορολογίας. Ο δεύτερος λόγος είναι ότι μειώνονται οι μισθοί, μειώθηκε όμως λόγω και της ύφεσης η επενδυτική ζήτηση, μειώθηκε πάρα πολύ η παραγωγικότητα της εργασίας. Και τελικά μέσω της μείωσης της παραγωγικότητας της εργασίας, ακόμα και το μοναδιαίο κόστος εργασίας, που είναι ο λόγος των μισθών προς την παραγωγικότητα, τελικά αυξήθηκε. δεν μειώθηκε. Η πτώση της παραγωγικότητας ήταν μεγαλύτερη από την πτώση των μισθών. Και ο τρίτος, το οποίο όταν είδα τα στοιχεία εμένα μου έκαναν φοβερή εντύπωση, ό,τι υποτίθεται κέρδισε η χώρα από τη μείωση των μισθών, υποτίθεται, το έχασε από την αύξηση των τιμών στο κόστος της ενέργειας. Όπου το κόστος της ενέργειας έχει αυξηθεί κατά μέσο όρο πάνω από 30%, και γι' αυτό βλέπουμε κυρίως βιομηχανίες, οι οποίες είναι ενεργοβόρες, ουσιαστικά να θέλουν να φύγουν από τη χώρα και να έχουν ένα υπέρμετρο βάρος. Τέλος, ο τέταρτος λόγος, σημαντικός λόγος, είναι ότι παρά τις διαρθρωτικές μεταρρυθμίσεις, δεν έχει γίνει σχεδόν τίποτα για το άνοιγμα των αγορών, των τελικών αγορών. Υπάρχουν ολιγοπωλιακές πρακτικές. Σε κάθε κλάδο, κυρίως στα τρόφιμα, 2 ή 3 επιχειρήσεις έχουν πάνω από το 60 ή 70% μεριδίου αγοράς και ελέγχουν και το εισαγωγικό εμπόριο. Και επομένως υπάρχουν πολλά εμπόδια στην είσοδο νέων επιχειρήσεων και πολλά εμπόδια τα οποία δίνουν τη δυνατότητα σε κάποιες επιχειρήσεις να κρατούν πολύ υψηλά τα ποσοστά κέρδους τους. Και τέλος, κάτι το οποίο θα το δείξω μετά με ένα συγκεκριμένο παράδειγμα στον χώρο της ενέργειας, υπάρχουν μέσα από κανονιστικές ρυθμίσεις, διατηρούνται πολύ υψηλές εγγυημένες τιμές, ιδιαίτερα στον χώρο της ενέργειας, ακριβώς για αυτό που θα έλεγα εγώ, κορπορατίστικους ή πελατειακούς λόγους, που ουσιαστικά είναι προνόμια προς συγκεκριμένους παραγωγούς. Τι μας λέει το Διεθνές Νομισματικό Ταμείο? Διάβασα με πολύ προσοχή την έκθεσή του. Μας λέει ότι η νέη δημοσιονομική προσαρμογή ήταν πρωτοφανής. Δεν το συνδέει όμως καθόλου αυτό με τις οικονομικές, κοινωνικές, πολιτικές επιπτώσεις. Μας λέει ότι υποτίμησε τους πολλαπλασιαστές, δηλαδή το μέγεθος της ύφεσης λόγω της δημοσιονομικής προσαρμογής. Δεν μας εξηγεί όμως γιατί. Μας λέει ότι έπρεπε να έχει γίνει αναδιάρθρωση του χρέους νωρίς. Σωστό, αλλά γιατί δεν έγινε και γιατί δεν γίνεται ακόμα και τώρα. Μας λέει ότι το χρέος κατά πάσα πιθανότητα δεν είναι διαχειρίσιμο, το σημερινό χρέος, αλλά κανένας δεν κάνει κάτι γι' αυτό. Μας λέει ότι οι διαρθρωτικές μεταρρυθμίσεις καθυστέρησαν, αλλά δεν υπάρχει αξιολόγηση, όπως θα προσπαθήσουμε να κάνουμε. Και τελικά, εν κατακλείδη, όπως είπε και ο προαλληλής σας, περισσότερο από το ίδιο πρόγραμμα. Αυτό είναι το πρόγραμμα και έτσι πρέπει να συνεχίσουμε. Δεν θα μπω στο κάθε ένα παράγοντα, γιατί ο χρόνος είναι περιορισμένος. Απλώς θέλω να πω στο πρώτο θέμα ότι τι δεν λέει το Διεθνές Νομισματικό Ταμείο στην αξιολόγησή του. Πρώτον, ότι το ίδιο το PSI ήταν πολύ ακριβό. Και υπάρχει μια πολύ ωραία μελέτη του Ζέτελμάιερ, του Τρέμπες και του Γκουλάτη στο Economic Policy, για όσους από εσάς συναδέλφους ή φοιτητές θέλουν να δούνε στο Economic Policy, που εξηγεί ουσιαστικά τους βασικούς λόγους γιατί ακόμα και το PSI, που έγινε καθυστερημένα μετά από 2,5 περίπου χρόνια, ήταν πολύ ακριβό για την ελληνική κυβέρνηση. Και έδωσε τέτοια κίνητρα στις τράπεζες να καλύψουν ζημιές που ουσιαστικά είχε κόστος για την ελληνική οικονομία. Το πιο σημαντικό για μένα ήταν ότι η αναδιάρθρωση του χρέους καθυστέρησε και καθυστερεί, κυρίως διότι οι μεγάλες τράπεζες του εξωτερικού, κυρίως οι γερμανικές τράπεζες, έπρεπε να έχουν χρόνο να ξεφορτώσουν ομόλογα, πράγμα το οποίο έκαναν ελληνικά ομόλογα, πράγμα το οποίο έκαναν τα προηγούμενα χρόνια, 130 δις που λύσανε από το 2010 μέχρι το 2012, έτσι ώστε να μην υποστούν τις ζημιές που θα είχαν υποστεί εάν η αναδιάρθρωση γινόταν νωρίτερα. 130 δις. Την ίδια στιγμή έγινε η ανακεφαλαιοποίηση. Το ευρωπαϊκό σύστημα δεν είχε κανένα πρόβλημα να αντισταθμίσει τις ζημιές τους, ενώ καμία συζήτηση δεν έγινε για την αντιστάθμιση ζημιών σε φυσικά πρόσωπα ή σε νομικά πρόσωπα δημοσίου δικαίου, πανεπιστήμια, νοσοκομεία κτλ., που σε ένα βράδυ χάσαν 50% των περιουσιακών τους στοιχείων. Γι' αυτό είναι και μια ηθική κρίση, όπως πολύ σωστά είπε ο προλαλής σας. Και αυτό το βάρος έπεσε στους Ευρωπαίους φορολογούμενους. Τι δεν μας λέει το IMF όσον αφορά τους πολλαπλασιαστές? Τόσο η Τρόικα, όσο και η ελληνική κυβέρνηση δεν πήραν υπόψη τη διάρθρωση της ελληνικής παραγωγής και της απασχόλησης. Το γεγονός ότι έχουμε πολύ μικρές επιχειρήσεις, περίπου 97% είναι πολύ μικρές επιχειρήσεις στην Ελλάδα, σημαίνει ότι όταν αυτές οι επιχειρήσεις δεν καλύπτουν το σταθερό τους κόστος, δεν έχουν περιθώρια μείωσης κερδών, ουσιαστικά κλείνουν. Και αυτή ήταν μία από τις βασικές συζητήσεις που θυμάμαι τον Ιούνιο και τον Ιούλιο είχαμε την Τρόικα, όπου προσπαθούσα να τους πω ότι αυτή η πολιτική της λιτότητας και της βίαιης μείωσης της αγοραστικής δύναμης τελικά θα έχει ως αποτέλεσμα το κλείσιμο χιλιάδων επιχειρήσεων, που θα είναι πάρα πολύ δύσκολο μετά να ξαναρχίσουν έτσι ώστε να υπάρχει ανάκαμψη. Αυτό λοιπόν, αυτός ο παράγων των διαρθρωτικών χαρακτηριστικών της οικονομίας και της απασχόλησης δεν είχε ληφθεί καθόλου υπόψη. Και επομένως οι ελληνικές επιχειρήσεις, κυρίως οι μικρές και μεσαίες επιχειρήσεις, βρεθήκανε κάτω από μια πιστωτική ασφυξία, μια μεγάλη πτώση του τζίρου της και πάρα πολλές κλείσανε. Τι δεν μας λέει? Δεν μας λέει ότι είχες και έχεις μια τεράστια κρίση ρευστότητας και δεν έχει γίνει τίποτα γι' αυτό. Μεταξύ 2009 και 2012 η πιστωτική επέκταση προς τις μικρές επιχειρήσεις μειώθηκε περίπου κατά 18% και στα νοικοκυριά περίπου 11%. Και σε όλες τις έρευνες που έχουν γίνει, οι ελληνικές επιχειρήσεις, οι μικρές κυρίως, μέσα στο σύνολο της Ευρώπης είχαν τα μεγαλύτερα προβλήματα πιστωτικής ασφυξίας, έλλειψης ρευστότητας. Από τα διαρθρωτικά ταμεία υπήρχαν πόροι και ξεκινήσαμε το 10 να φτιάχνουμε ταμεία χρηματοδότησης των μικρομεσαίων επιχειρήσεων. Μόλις τώρα αρχίζει να λειτουργεί το ΕΤΕΑΝ, έχει μερικούς μήνες που έχει λειτουργήσει, και αυτό υπολειτουργεί, διότι ουσιαστικά το ίδιο το τραπεζικό σύστημα το ελληνικό δεν έχει διοχετεύσει αυτούς τους πόρους που έπρεπε να διοχετεύσει για την χρηματοδότηση, ιδιαίτερα των πιο ευάλωτων μικρομεσαίων επιχειρήσεων. Τέλος, όπως και στην Ιρλανδία, δημιουργείται ένα μεγάλο πρόβλημα υπερχρέωσης νοικοκυριών και τα δάνεια αυτά δεν έχουν αναδιαρθρωθεί καθόλου, παρά τη μείωση του εισοδήματος και των προσόδων από περιουσιακά στοιχεία. Τέλος, αυτό που δεν λέει η αξιολόγηση του IMF είναι ότι παρά την ανακεφαλαιοποίηση του τραπεζικού συστήματος, κατά 50 δις, αυτό δεν θα συνδεθεί με διοχέτευση ρευστότητας στην πραγματική οικονομία, εκτός αν υπάρχουν πολύ συγκεκριμένα μέτρα για να γίνει αυτό. Άρα, ένας από τους λόγους για τη βαθιά ύφεση, πέρα από την αρχική δημοσιονομική περιστολή δαπανών, είναι ακριβώς ότι δεν ελήφθησαν καθόλου υπόψη η δομή και η διάρθρωση της ελληνικής οικονομίας και της απασχόλησης. Τέλος, που μπορεί να ενδιαφέρει περισσότερο, ότι τα ονομαζόμενα διαρθρωτικά μέτρα και οι μεταρρυθμίσεις έχουν αποκλειστικά δημοσιονομικό στόχο ή εξυπηρέτηση πολύ συγκεκριμένων συμφερόντων. Ας δούμε φορολογική μεταρρύθμιση. Αυξήσεις φορολογίας εισοδήματος, ακινήτων, έμεσης φορολογίας. Πολύ συγκεκριμένη κατάργηση φοροαπαλλαγών για συγκεκριμένες ομάδες. Πολύ λίγη προσπάθεια να διευρυνθεί η φορολογική βάση και να υπάρξει πάταξη της φοροδιαφυγής. Αποδιάρθρωση της φορολογικής διοίκησης. Η κατάργηση των εφοριών που έγινε, υποτίθεται για αναδιοργάνωση των εφοριών, έχει διαλύσει ακόμα και βασικές υπηρεσίες ελεγκτικές. Από την τζιά που υπήρχε η εφορία, τώρα πρέπει να πάει κάποιος στο Κοροπή. Από την ορεινή ναύπακτο πρέπει να πάει στο Μεσολόγγι για την εφορία. Και δεν υπάρχει καμία προσπάθεια να κάνεις μια φορολογική μεταρρύθμιση η οποία να έχει έναν αναπτυξιακό στόχο. Η ονομαζόμενη διοικητική μεταρρύθμιση. Τι είναι? Οριζόντιες περικοπές, προγράμματα κινητικότητας, διαθεσιμότητας, τα οποία ουσιαστικά μειώνουν υπερβολικά το εισόδημα κόσμου και οδηγούν σε απολύσεις, κλείσιμο επιχειρήσεων. Οι ονομαζόμενοι οι μεταρρυθμίσεις στον εργατικό τομέα. Οριζόντιες περικοπές, μείωση του μέσου κόστους, κατάργηση και αποδόμηση των συλλογικών διαπραγματεύσεων, απελευθέρωση των αγορών και καταπάτηση βασικών εργασιακών δικαιωμάτων, μαζί με απομείωση του ελεγκτικού ρόλου του ΣΕΠΕ και άλλων. Και τελικά, κάτι πιο σημαντικό, η ονομαζόμενη θεσμική μεταρρύθμιση, εάν τη δείτε προσεκτικά σε συγκεκριμένους κλάδους, θα δείτε μία μείωση του ανταγωνισμού. Το είδαμε στον τραπεζικό τομέα, με τη δημιουργία πλέον 4 συστημικών τραπεζών με πολύ λίγο ανταγωνισμό μεταξύ τους, και το βλέπουμε σε βαθμό απίθανο στον ενεργειακό τομέα. Στον ενεργειακό τομέα η κατάσταση είναι, αν θέλετε, ένα τρομακτικό παράδειγμα της πώς μέσα από κανονιστικές ρυθμίσεις και διαδικασία απελευθέρωσης ουσιαστικά γίνεται μια μεγάλη μεταφορά πόρων από τους πολλούς σε ολίγους. Να πω ένα παράδειγμα, ότι ουσιαστικά μέσα από τις εγγυημένες τιμές, το ελληνικό κράτος έχει χάσει πάνω από 1 δις. Ένα μόνο παράδειγμα, οι αμοιβές για τα, όπως λέγονται, αποδεικτικά ισχύως, στα αγγλικά λέγεται Capacity Assurance Mechanisms, είναι μια ελληνική πρωτοτυπία. Ουσιαστικά οι ιδιώτες πάροχοι, οι οποίοι μπαίνουν στο σύστημα, τους έχουμε εξασφαλίσει εγγυημένη τιμή, ακόμα και αν παράγουν και διαθέτουν ρεύμα ή δεν διαθέτουν ρεύμα. Το 1999, όταν πέρασε ο νόμος, δεν προβλεπόταν καμία αμοιβή. Το 5 αυτό έγινε 25.000 ευρώ ανά μεγαβατόρα. Το 2010 ανέβηκε στις 35.000. Το 2011 45.000. Το 2013, 1η Ιουλίου, 90.000 για τους παρόχους φυσικού αερίου, με ένα συνολικό κόστος 550 εκατομμυρίων ευρώ, τα οποία τα πληρώνουμε εμείς ως καταναλωτές μέσα από τις ρυθμιζόμενες χρεώσεις στα τιμολόγια μας και άλλα. Στις ανανεώσιμες πηγές ουσιαστικά έγινε το ίδιο πάρτι, με πολύ υψηλές τιμές για κίνητρο για την παραγωγή, οι οποίες στην Ελλάδα ήταν τιμές μεταξύ 200 και 500 ευρώ τη μεγαβατόρα, όταν στην Κύπρο, που έγινε ανοιχτός διαγωνισμός, οι τιμές ανά μεγαβατόρα ήταν μεταξύ 77 και 97 ευρώ. Ενώ τα τέλη για τις ανανεώσιμες πηγές αυξηθήκανε, πόσο λέτε, 6.900% ανάμεσα στο 2009 και 2013. Ήταν 0,30 ευρώ τη μεγαβατόρα το 2009 και το 2013 είναι 20 ευρώ τη μεγαβατόρα, δημιουργώντας ένα έλλειμμα για τη ΛΑΓΕ, που είναι ο διαχειριστής του συστήματος, 600 εκατομμυρίων ευρώ. Ακούτε την Τρόικα να λέει τίποτα γι' αυτό? Ακούμε την ελληνική κυβέρνηση να μιλάει καθόλου ή να συζητάμε στο δημόσιο διάλογο για τις αποφάσεις της ΡΑΕ? Όχι. Γιατί? Διότι αν ψάξετε, από πίσω υπάρχουν 5 μεγάλες επιχειρήσεις που ουσιαστικά ωφελούνται από μια πολύ μεγάλη μεταβίβαση πόρων από τους Έλληνες φορολογούμενους στους συγκεκριμένους παρόχους. Υπάρχει λύση. Επιτρέψτε μου, επειδή ο χρόνος τρέχει, να πω ότι ναι, υπάρχει λύση. Και η λύση αυτή, μαζί με τον Δημήτρη Παπαδημητρίου, τον Γιώργο τον Αργίτη, έχουμε καταθέσει τις απόψεις μας για το τι πρέπει να γίνει. Αλλά πολύ επιγραμματικά θα έλεγα ότι αν ήθελε μια κυβέρνηση να αλλάξει πορεία και να βγει η χώρα από την κρίση, μπορεί να το κάνει. Και μπορεί να το κάνει μέσα από ενεργητικές πολιτικές επενδύσεων και παραγωγικής αναδιάρθρωσης. Μπορεί να το κάνει εάν αποφασίσει να κάτσει στο τραπέζι των διαπραγματεύσεων και να αναδιαπραγματευτεί σοβαρά το χρέος. Μπορεί να το κάνει αν μαζί με αυτό εξασφαλίσει ότι θα πέσει χρήμα στην αγορά, ότι στην πραγματική οικονομία μέσα από συγκεκριμένους μηχανισμούς. Μπορεί να το κάνει εάν στο πακέτο αυτό, το εναλλακτικό, μπουν ενεργητικές πολιτικές απασχόλησης και δημιουργίας ενός δίκτυ προστασίας για τις πιο ευάλωτες ομάδες. Και πάνω απ' όλα μπορεί να το κάνει αν θέλει να σπάσει αυτό το κλειστό κύκλωμα εξουσίας, να ανοίξει τους θεσμούς και όπως ο συνάδελφος, ο κ. Ασέμογλου, έγραψε σε ένα πολύ σημαντικό βιβλίο που λέει «Γιατί τα έθνη αποτυγχάνουν», ουσιαστικά να αντικαταστήσει θεσμούς υπεξαίρεσης με θεσμούς δημοκρατικής συμμετοχής και συμμετοχικότητας. Μεταρρυθμίσεις για στήριξη των επενδύσεων. Δεν θα μπω σε όλα, γιατί δεν έχουμε χρόνο. Για μένα 5 είναι οι βασικές μεταρρυθμίσεις. Μια θεσμική μεταρρύθμιση, η οποία ξεκίνησε το 10, αλλά έχει σταματήσει και δεν είναι στις προτεραιότητες ούτε της κυβέρνησης, ούτε της Τρόικας. Η απλούστευση των διαδικασιών ίδρυσης, αδειοδότησης, λειτουργίας επιχειρήσεων και επίλυσης διαφορών. Ξεκίνησε με το πρώτο βήμα, με την έναρξη των επιχειρήσεων, ουσιαστικά καρκινοβατεί από τότε και ένας επενδυτής δεν μπορεί μέσα σε εύλογο χρονικό διάστημα να αδειοδοτηθεί και να προχωρήσει. Φορολογική μεταρρύθμιση. Υπάρχουν πάρα πολλές προτάσεις για διεύρυνση της φορολογικής βάσης, για διασύνδεση ηλεκτρονική των εφοριών, για προγραμματικούς προϋπολογισμούς, για ουσιαστικά ενίσχυση των εσωτερικών μηχανισμών σε κάθε οργανισμό και θα έλεγα και στη συζήτηση μπορούμε να πούμε πάρα πολλά παραδείγματα ή από την αγορά των φαρμάκων ή από άλλα. Μεταρρύθμιση στον χώρο της δικαιοσύνης, η οποία και αυτή καρκινοβατεί. Υπάρχουν προβλήματα σημαντικά καθυστερήσεων και κακοδικίας. στα οποία μπορούν να γίνουν πολλά.
Κυρία Κατσέλη,
Τελειώνω.
έχουμε ξεπεράσει το χρόνο
Ναι.
κατά πολύ.
Ωραία. Μεταρρύθμιση, τελειώνω. Μεταρρύθμιση στον χώρο της διακυβέρνησης, με πολύ συγκεκριμένες προτάσεις, κυρίως για την αναδιοργάνωση του δημόσιου τομέα και κυρίως με την πολιτική αναπτυξιακού προγραμματισμού σε επίπεδο περιφερειών, όπου ολοκληρωμένα επενδυτικά projects και προγράμματα μπορούν να προωθηθούν. Αναδιάρθρωση του χρέους, εσωτερικού και εξωτερικού. Διοχέτευση ρευστότητας στην αγορά, με πολύ συγκεκριμένα εργαλεία, μικροπιστώσεις, με την έναρξη του κοινωνικού ταμείου, το οποίο και αυτό δεν λειτουργεί, του ΕΤΕΑΝ, και κάτι που πολύ σημαντικό, βασικά η δημιουργία θέσεων εργασίας, και βλέπω τη Ράνια, την Αντωνοπούλου και τον Δημήτριο Παπαδημητρίου, όπου ουσιαστικά είναι μία από τις βασικές προτάσεις που ήταν και πίσω από την κοινοφελή εργασία, τα προγράμματα κοινοφελούς εργασίας για τη στήριξη της εργασίας και αναδιοργάνωση όλου του συστήματος των κοινωνικών μεταβιβάσεων, διότι υπάρχουν τρομακτικές στρεβλώσεις που αυτή τη στιγμή εντείνουν την μη πληρωμή ασφαλιστικών εισφορών. Γιατί αυτά δεν γίνονται? Γιατί δεν είναι στο ραντάρ της Τρόικας? Η Τρόικα η ίδια, μέχρι την τελευταία λεπτομέρεια, μιλάει για την απελευθέρωση της αγοράς εργασίας. Δεν μιλάνε όμως καθόλου για όλες τις άλλες τις μεταρρυθμίσεις, οι οποίες ουσιαστικά θα στήριζαν την ανάκαμψη και την επένδυση. Και γι' αυτό καταλήγω στο ίδιο συμπέρασμα, όπου κατέληξε ο προλαλής σας, ότι αυτή η κρίση είναι μια κρίση ουσιαστικά ηθική, είναι η επικράτηση μιας νεοκλασικής, νεοφιλελεύθερης προσέγγισης στην οικονομική πολιτική, που από πίσω όμως έχει πολύ συγκεκριμένα συμφέροντα. Γι' αυτό το τελευταίο σημείο που θέλω να πω είναι ότι από αυτή την κρίση δεν θα βγούμε παρά μόνο με μια βαθύτατη θεσμική ανατροπή, όπου ουσιαστικά θα αποφασίσουμε όλοι μαζί να προωθήσουμε μια μεγαλύτερη διαφάνεια, να ανοίξουμε τους θεσμούς μας και να τους μετατρέψουμε από θεσμούς υπεξαίρεσης σε θεσμούς πραγματικά συμμετοχικούς θεσμούς και να βάλουμε κανόνες λειτουργίας για όλους, έτσι ώστε να μην υπάρχουν κλειστά κυκλώματα τα οποία ουσιαστικά να κερδίζουν στις πλάτες πολλών οι λίγοι. Μπορεί να γίνει, αλλά ουσιαστικά χρειάζεται μια πολύ μεγάλη ανατροπή πολιτική, η οποία θα μπορέσει να δώσει καρπούς στο μέλλον, αν όχι για τη δική μας γενιά, τουλάχιστον για τη γενιά των παιδιών μας. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Ευχαριστούμε την κυρία Κατσέλη. Πήρε λίγο χρόνο από τους επόμενους ομιλητές. Ο κύριος Polychroniou από το Levy Institute θα αναγκαστεί λίγο να πάει πιο γρήγορα. Θα μας μιλήσει για την...
Δεν θα βγάλω πολιτικό λόγο, αλλά θα έχω το χρόνο μου. Hello. Thank you for being here. As you probably know, the theme of the panel is growth, job, and well-being in Greece and Europe. It would have been my pleasure indeed to stand up here and talk to you about happiness, or Xydakis, especially in our beloved Greece. Unfortunately, I'm going to talk about misery in contemporary Greece. I have a political economy reading to offer to you about the current Greek catastrophe, which I have opted to title. Where's the title? There's no title. Okay. The economics of social disaster. Other equally suitable titles might have been The Greek Crisis in the Age of European Neoliberal Terror, or Fiscal Sadism and the Pillage of a Nation. Trust me, any one of those titles would do the job about what is happening in Greece today. So what I'm about to suggest to you stands in sharp contradistinction to the official government version about the so-called Greek success story. But also, of course, it's a very blunt analysis from the other side of the coin about what you heard yesterday from a certain gentleman from the European Central Bank. I think mine will be just as blunt, and you just have to judge for yourself as to which one might be more accurate. Now, any attempt to deconstruct the Greek crisis, as far as I'm concerned, must engage in a multi-level type of analysis. A, it must expose and critique the economic thinking behind the policies guiding today's Greek bailout. Second, the analysis must, of course, take into account the Greek crisis itself, because there is something special about Greece, although we may not like to talk about this. I think there is something special about it. I don't know to what extent it distinguishes us from Ireland, but I think it does, with all due respect to my friend Terry there. And the third level of analysis must, of course, take into account the current European project to which Greece is a passionate participant. Okay. I will start with a critique of the economic thinking, which is currently guiding the policies of the Troika and, of course, of the subservient Greek government. Behind it is a set of dogmas that are firmly embedded in what is known as mainstream economics. Well, mainstream economics is a bogus science, plain and simple. There is no other discipline in the social sciences that relies, for instance, so heavily on statistical data and mathematical formulas and what might have you, and yet is so woefully inadequate in explaining, analyzing, and predicting the very processes that allegedly the dismal science studies. The global financial crisis of 2007-08, of course, is a major case in point. Virtually the entire mainstream academic profession was caught with its pants down when Lehman Brothers collapsed, touching off a worldwide financial crisis. They simply did not expect it. Why not? The reason is because most mainstream economists seem to have convinced themselves, based on the very fanciful models of financial engineering that they had developed in the last 20, 30 years, that capitalism somehow had matured into a stable and crisis-free socioeconomic system. Okay? Indeed, the prevailing belief was that money now somehow could be created out of the thin air. Well, call it the derivative scheme. Big, powerful institutions could accumulate wealth without generating new wealth, and the financial predators could plunder at will. All these things could happen, and nothing would really happen to the economy. In the eyes of the prophet of the new economic era, the rediscovery of man's lost God, i.e. free markets, meant that symmetry and perfection, i.e. permanent stability and endless accumulation, opened the path for the realization of an economic order free from the contractual fragility and destruction of the business cycle usually associated with capitalism's troubled past. Okay. The dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models and the other deterministic models that had been built around the notion of rational and efficient markets and what might have you, all of which, of course, are loaded with completely ahistorical and asocial normative assumptions, allowed no room for questioning the mechanics of financial engineering and the brave new world promised by the high priests of free market capitalism. Subsequently, mainstream economists and pundits never saw the latest financial disaster coming, although Hyman Mincy had been warning about those things for many, many years, going back to the early 1980s. And even though the revenge of the real economy over the paper economy is a scenario that has played itself out countless of times in the history of modern capitalism. But this is the price paid for replacing political economy, which I represent, with mathematical economics and narrow-minded econometric analysis, for ignoring history and social theory, and even for deriding philosophy's insights into human nature. Suffice to say, if contemporary economists had bothered to read even the first volume of Marx's Das Kapital, or take seriously Marshall's dire warnings against turning economic analysis into formal mathematical models, or pay close attention to Keynes' reasoned approach to aggregate demand in the business cycle, or to Minsky's, of course, financial instability hypothesis, any one of those options might have done the trick. We could have been spared the follies associated with a rather absurd undertaking of turning a social science into Newtonian physics and positing the capitalist universe as endless progress toward unlimited accumulation aided by free market alchemy. We might also have avoided the countless financial and economic crises that have occurred since the ascendancy of an illusory but dangerous neoliberal economic order. But ignorance of history and politics, unfortunately, runs through mainstream economic analysis and policymaking like a red thread, which makes one wonder, truly, what prevents contemporary capitalism from collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions? Well, actually, we do know the reason, and it's none other than the occasional massive intervention of the very institutions that neoliberals hate to talk about, i.e. the state. Or alternatively, what prevents today the millions of unemployed, the socially and economically disadvantaged, and those left behind by the ruthlessly misguided policies of trickle-down economics, fiscal austerity, untamed markets, from rising up to challenge the ever-growing inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth? Throughout the Western nations, this is not a problem that affects Greece, okay? We're not sure about those reasons, why they're not rising up in any case. It's a scenario that still could play itself out. In the actual world now of economic policy making, the analysis and the projections by the International Monetary Fund constitute the finest example of the God that failed, i.e. economic forecasting based on blind faith in neoliberal policies and free market dogma. The IMF projections historically, they're notoriously for being inconsistent, off the mark, precisely because they are fixated on imposing anti-growth structural adjustment requirements that typically produce massive economic devastation, as evidenced by countless examples worldwide. Still, committed to perverse ideological and political ends rather than objective scientific evidence, the institution remains stubbornly fond of prescribing the same medicine for ailing economies, no matter what their geographical origin may be or their unique socioeconomic and cultural characteristics. In the neoliberal worldview of the IMF, one size fits all. Little surprise, then, that the IMF's quack doctors usually end up with the economies that they treat in a coma, like Greece today. That they call stabilization, by the way. The shock treatments that the IMF applies to ailing economies have one explicit goal: to roll back the average standard of living in order to create highly favorable conditions for international business investment opportunities and to increase the rate of profit for the corporate and financial elite at home. It is an avowedly class warfare approach. Nobody would like to talk about this, but that's what it is. Cloaked in the organization's holier-than-thou rhetoric about the overall benefits of a neoliberal economic order, about how organized labor and workers' rights, social welfare provisions, decent wages, etc., all of those things constitute a drag on an economy. Well, at the heart of the neoliberal vision is a societal and world order based on the prioritization of corporate power, free markets, and the abandonment of public services. That's what it's all about. The neoliberal claim is that economies would perform more effectively, producing greater wealth and economic prosperity for all if markets were allowed to function without government intervention. This claim is predicated on the idea that free markets are inherently just and can create effective, low-cost ways to produce consumer goods and services. Subsequently, an interventionist or state-managed economy is wasteful and inefficient, choking off growth and expansion by constraining innovation and a so-called entrepreneurial spirit. This is the version of neoliberalism that was developed by Milton Friedman and the Chicago schoolboys and is usually associated, by the way, with the Pinochet regime in Chile, and later with the free market policies of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, an ideological revolution, really, that was long in the making, but gained ascendancy over Keynesianism with the appearance of stagflation in the United States in the 1970s. And it is by far, as far as I am concerned, the most dangerous ideology of our time, spreading havoc with its economics of social disaster. Enter Greece, or Hellas, or a banana republic today, I'm sorry to say. 3.5 years ago, Greece, a weak and peripheral economy in the euro area, which, as far as I'm concerned, I don't mind saying, had no business in the first place taking part in the wildest experiment in financial and monetary history, as it was totally unfit for it, went bankrupt, but was subsequently bailed out by its Euro partners and the IMF. Ever since, the small southern Mediterranean nation and the birth of democracy, let's not forget, has been a guinea pig for the policy prescriptions of a neoliberal European Union under the command of Germany and its northern allies, with the IMF serving essentially, we have to say this, as a junior partner, okay? It is the European Union, for the most part, that is imposing these policies. The IMF is here in order for the policies that the European Union is imposing to be justified. In my eyes, that is clear. So what is happening now is a public debt has been used as an opportunity to dismantle a rudimentary social state, because God knows Greece never had a real social state, to sell off profitable public enterprises and state assets at bargain prices, to deprive labor of even the most basic rights, to substantially reduce wages, salaries, and pensions, essentially, as I said, to create a de facto banana republic, all with the support of a significant segment of the Greek financial financial-industrial class, and with the assistance, of course, of the domestic political elite of the country, which, since the onset of the crisis, has relied heavily on dictatorial action in order to carry out the commands of the country's foreign creditors. Now Greece is on the verge of a collapse. The country is facing an outright humanitarian crisis in the midst of one of the wealthiest regions in the global economy. The nation's output, I mean, everyone knows these facts by now, the nation's output has experienced a cumulative decline of probably close by 25%. The official unemployment has climbed to 28%. Will soon hit probably the 30% mark. Over 30% of the citizens live near or below the poverty line. The debt to GDP ratio has increased from, 125 in 2009 to close to 170 today, even after a major haircut that took place, okay? Because of the draconian budget cuts in the name of expansionary austerity, the public healthcare system lays in ruins. You are going to hear from David Stuckler about the unbelievable catastrophe that Greece is facing in the health area. Public universities are being literally dismantled and what might have you. In sum, 3.5 years after the European Union and the IMF, which I call them the twin monsters of global neoliberalism, after they came to the rescue, Greece has been transformed formally, officially, from a developed economy into an emerging economy, posting unemployment and poverty rates that are normally associated with the so-called third world nations, and, probably worse than all, is permanently stuck in a vicious cycle of debt, austerity, and depression. The economic catastrophe in Greece, reflecting the biggest decline of the gross national product and the highest rate of unemployment of any country in recent history, speaks volumes about economic damage and the social pain that the neoliberal-oriented policymakers of the European Union and of the International Monetary Fund can deliver to societies via the domestic political establishment. Okay? To be sure, long before the IMF admitted to having made gross errors in the first Greek bailout plan, most economic observers knew that the plan wasn't going to work. I mean, if you look at the literature, most economists were saying, this is a terrible plan, it's not going to work. Why? Well, to some extent, because it was a bailout plan more in line with a desire to inflict punishment on a profligate southern member state participating in the euro area and in order to protect the European banking system. Okay? It was not a strategic plan with a design to provide a solution for the financial crisis in a peripheral country, which essentially amounted to a structural crisis in the very institutional design of the European monetary system as a whole. So make no mistake about it. The so-called rescue of Greece, as some very reputable newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have been emphasizing over and over again, it was not a plan to rescue Greece, it was a plan to rescue the Eurozone at the expense of Greece. Of course, astute and politically attuned analysts could also see that the so-called bailout plan was in tune with a mindless neoliberal social engineering that has driven the agenda of financial global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, etc., in the last 35 years or so. And as I said before, the goals have remained the same throughout those 35 or so years. It's essentially to roll back the standard of living, to create favorable investment opportunities, and what might have you. And just like Soviet communism, and I know this might surprise some of you, global neoliberalism has produced a dystopia which is causing increasingly economic downturns and employment crises, financial shocks, poverty, and social exclusion. The Greek bailout, as far as I'm concerned, was an imperial in design plan. It denied a bankrupt country the opportunity to restructure its debt immediately, instead offering its government a massive loan package that carried a usurious interest rate, 5% if you remember, and included onerous demands. A rapid fiscal consolidation program that had not been seen in policy-making circles since the harsh economic adjustment program imposed by Ceausescu on the Romanians in the 1980s. For those of you who may not know, he was eager to repay the loans that he had received from the IMF for clearly geopolitical reasons and what might have you. Okay? The severity of the fiscal adjustment program that is being enforced in Greece is on an equal level with the Ceausescu policies back in the 1980s. The bailout plan was a bad plan. It was a terrible plan. It was as bad as the Greek political establishment itself, let's be honest, okay? But it takes two to tango. So little wonder why the Troika all along has relied on the same political characters in order to have its policies carried out, which of course has brought the country to the brink of a disaster. What kind of governments would have accepted those terms so obediently, proposing nothing as an alternative? I'm not going to answer this. You answer it. Okay. In less than 2 years after the implementation of the first bailout, and with every relevant economic and social index in catastrophic course, the official unemployment, for instance, increased by some 30%, the GDP shrunk annually by over 6%, the debt increased by some 60 billion, okay? A second bailout agreement was put in place for the sum of, what, 130 billion euro, okay? So if the first plan doesn't work, it leads you into a catastrophic course. What do? You just introduce a new one with even harsher conditions, okay? But, you know, I mean, there's nothing surprising here. I mean, the IMF has pretty much followed the same policy, the same strategy all along. The sicker the patient gets, you know, you prescribe a higher dose of the same medicine. Okay. So, have no illusions about it. To this day, the European Union and the IMF officials remain as ever committed to the policies that are responsible for the collapse of Greece, and don't pay any attention to the IMF's admission that it misjudged the impact of austerity, etc., etc. I mean, these are technical problems, dilemmas, you know, issues that sort of bother some of the people in the IMF. Okay. The reason why they're not going to back down on their own out of this program is because the shock treatments administered have 3 explicit goals in mind as far as I can see. And I keep telling you again, I'm trying to deconstruct the whole program that is being enforced for the last 3.5 years. One is to, of course, ensure that the loans are paid back, no matter what the cost. B, to roll back the average standard of living in order to create this kind of favorable conditions that I talked about. And 3, I think, to strip the country of its natural resource wealth. I think this is becoming more and more clearly lately. Okay? So it was not by accident that the European Union and the IMF officials were completely ignorant of the nature, the composition, the dynamics of the Greek crisis when it first broke out, rushed to declare that the roots of the Greek crisis were to be found in an allegedly bloated public sector. Okay, as one of the speakers said before, the problem with the Greek public sector was not its size. Okay, it was inefficiency. I don't have to go over that.
Κύριε Polychroniou, πλησιάζουμε τη μισή ώρα και θα δυσκολέψουμε την επόμενη session.
Okay.
Λίγο οικονομία.
Ναι, αυτό θα μπορούσατε να το κάνετε και με τον προηγούμενο ομιλητή, πιο σύντομα από το κάνατε, τέλος πάντων.
Εντάξει, τώρα ό,τι έγινε, ας βοηθήσουμε λίγο να προχωρήσουμε.
Κατανοώ, αλλά... Okay, I will not comment any further on that. Well, I wanted to say 3 things very quickly. First of all, about the Greek crisis itself, as I said, there were 3 elements. It doesn't look like I'm going to get into them. But the Greek crisis itself has what I call a 3-nature, it's a 3-nature crisis. Okay, all of those things about corruption, inefficiency, what might have you, these are all true. We know how the Greek political system, including all of the politicos, operated in the last 30 or so years. You had essentially a ruling political class that was using the state and its coffers as a means to enrich itself and its parasitic capitalist partners. Let's not think that what the Greek politicians were simply doing was ripping off the state and the public for themselves. They were at the same time, in alliance with some of the most parasitic capitalist elements in the country, and they were using the state and its coffers for that mean. Okay. And of course, to cater to the demands of its political clientele in order to create an army of voters faithful to the party. And of course, I heard yesterday a number of people saying, well, the citizens should begin looking into themselves. Why are they not taking responsibility? Well, you created these citizens yourself for the last 30 years. Don't put the blame on them today. Okay? So now, in terms of the crisis, very, very simply, I will say this. It has to be seen as something more than just the outcome of corrupt government practices, etc., although it's all there. The Greek crisis is the story of a kleptocratic state, and I must tell you where that term comes from, for those of you who are very young. One of the key advisors of Mr. Andreas Papandreou back in the early 1980s came to Greece from the United States, a brilliant sociologist of international stature, etc. He knew nothing about Greece, but within 2 months, he came up with this term to describe the Greek state, a kleptocratic state. Okay, well, it has remained a kleptocratic state, even down to this day, probably much more so today. So it is the story of a kleptocratic state and a parasitic capitalist class, and I underline this, a parasitic capitalist class, and Professor Katseli, indeed, to a large extent, consciously or not, seemed to have highlighted or underlined this notion when she was talking about the transfer of wealth from the many to the few, etc. In any case, the kleptocratic state and this parasitic capitalist class got caught in the web of the Eurozone's flawed design when the financial crisis broke out. That's one part. It is also a story of an economy which, as I said before, simply did not belong in the European Union. I'm sorry, not in the European, in the Eurozone, in the monetary union. If we take the claim that it is an optimal currency area. Nor did he make any attempt to fit into this currency, okay? So that's another part of the story. But it is also the story of the general failure of the global neoliberal project that Terry McDonough spoke about earlier, okay? So indeed, how else could Eurozone countries with such a dissimilar economies, Greece, a statist and highly corrupt economy, Ireland, a poster child for the neoliberal capitalism, Spain, a faithful follower of European Union dictates, they all suffer the same fate. Okay? There's something else going on here. I regret to say that I don't have the time to go into the last pillar of the deconstruction of the Greek crisis, which is the European Union itself. A highly elitist, a highly undemocratic institution, which needs to be revised as the Eurozone itself. Otherwise, as many economists have said, I don't think the Eurozone is going to be around for much longer. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε και για τον ελάχιστο χρόνο που μας χαρίσατε, κύριε Polychroniou. Ο κύριος David Stuckler, τελευταίος ομιλητής σε αυτό το session, ερευνητής από το Πανεπιστήμιο της Οξφόρδης. Θέλει και αυτός 20 λεπτά. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to join you. And thanks to all of you for sticking around to the end for the last but not least session, covering what I believe is one of the most important topics for the future of Greece and the future of Europe. And that's, what is the impact of the recession, of austerity, and the ongoing crisis on our most valuable asset, our health, and that of our families. It's now 5 years since the worst crisis, since the Great Depression began. People have lost homes, they've lost jobs, many trapped in unpayable debt and poverty. Here in Greece, 2 in 3 youth are out of work and unable to find it. And amidst all this social suffering, politicians have been debating endlessly how to deal with debts and deficits, with little regard to the human costs of those decisions. And all too often, the stories of individual suffering get lost in the debate. Let me introduce you to Maria Sopranzi, on your left, 68, a retired school teacher, and her husband on the right, Romeo Dionisi, 62, a bricklayer who found it impossible to find work in Italy's recession. So to make ends meet, he took early retirement to support his family. But he soon became, along with his wife, 2 of Italy's esodati, meaning exiled ones, when the Monti government, to shore up budget deficits, extended the pension aid, leaving hundreds of thousands in Italy, older persons, plunged into poverty without a safety net. Feeling there was no way out but to scrum through rubbish bins to survive, on the morning of April 5th, 6 months ago, Romeo and his wife sat down for breakfast, wrote a note asking for forgiveness, and then hung themselves in their storage closet of their seaside home in Civitanova Marche. On hearing the news, Maria's brother, Giuseppe Sopranzi, 73, overcome with grief, threw himself into the Adriatic Sea. These 3 tragedies were but 3 of more than 10,000 suicides over and above historical trends that we've documented in the crisis. The correlation of economic hardship, of unemployment, and depression is well known. And if this were just a story about suicide, we would agree it's tragic and unfortunate. What we've learned is that these tragedies are not inevitable. And in the countries undergoing the deepest cuts, the deepest austerity measures, we've seen greater suicides, heart attacks, alcohol-related deaths, HIV, and infectious diseases, to name a few. Austerity has been a massive experiment on the people of Europe. It was a treatment designed to cure debts and deficits, to stimulate confidence in private sector investment, and help economies recover. 3 years after this experiment began, the economic results are in. What I have here is a comparison of the US and UK, 2 match countries which were at the epicenter of a toxic mortgage bubble. Its banks were highly leveraged. Leaders of both countries bailed out their banking sectors, and both began to start charting a slow recovery around the second quarter of 2009. But a key difference came when, under the Conservative coalition government in the UK, the Tory party pursued a path of £83 billion in deep austerity measures, whereas President Barack Obama in the United States introduced $800 billion in stimulus. And here you see the L-shaped recession that we heard from Terrence a moment ago. And while there are signs of shoots of recovery, the UK economy has yet to recover, marking the slowest recovery in the history of recessions. But I'm not here to talk about the economics, of which we've heard so much. I'm here to talk about health. And here you have a well-known association in public health and medicine that greater investment in social protections, from early childhood development programs straight through to old age pensions, are a critical determinant of our health, seen here in higher life expectancy. And what I'll argue today is that these social protection programs are not just a correlate, but have a powerful cause and effect relationship. That the nations that have done better in this recession, recovered faster, and improved their health have almost always had the strongest social safety nets. To test this thesis, we've looked at different cases in Europe, among them Greece, which is in the middle of a public health disaster. To meet budget deficit reduction targets set by the Troika, the International Monetary Fund, European Central Bank, and European Commission, Greece's health sector was given a target to maintain spending at 6% of GDP. Where that figure came from is unclear, given the UK spends about 8%, Germany 10%, the US in total about 19% of GDP. But in practice, at a time when many people were losing access to the ability to pay for private care, automatic stabilizers were driving up costs in the public sector. In practice, this meant deep, deep cuts. A journalist, incredulous, asked the health minister, Loverdos at the time, is it really true that you would aim to cut your hospital budget by 40% in 1 year alone. He threw up his hands and said, "Look, these are cuts not with a surgical scalpel, but a butcher's knife." Already, the consequences are starting to become clear. As the HIV prevention budget was cut in half, Greece became the only nation in Europe, apart from Romania, to experience a resurgence in HIV. New infections more than doubled, not when the recession began, but since 2010, when these cuts began to take effect. They weren't, as sometimes claimed, concentrated in immigrants, but in injection drug users, the group whose budgets were cut as needle exchange programs were slashed across inner-city Athens and the rest of the countries. The World Health Organization estimates there should be about 3 clean needles per drug users. Street charities in Athens estimate, there should be about 200 clean needles per drug user. Street charities estimate they're currently about 3. Other examples, as the mosquito spraying prevention budget was cut in the southern part of the country, Greece experienced for the first time since the early 1970s an outbreak of malaria, now threatening the tourist industry in that part of the country. And together with my colleague Alex Kentikalanis, who's here today, in a paper we published in the medical journal The Lancet, we've documented a series of serious, significant health concerns in Greece, not directly resulting from the crisis, but of deep cuts, including a 60% rise in suicides, a marked increase in infant mortality by 40% from the latest available data. We've seen a 50% increase in people reporting they're unable to access medically necessary care. Putting this in real terms, we estimated more than 60,000 pensioners in Greece now saying they can't get health treatments and services they need. The Troika's solution, seeing that pharmaceutical spending was high in Greece, to cut pharmaceutical budgets rather than bringing down costs, backfired as many pharmaceutical companies, such as Novo Nordisk, left in arrears, taking with them from the shelves insulin and other medicines which people in Greece with type 2 diabetes had relied on. And I could go on about the panic in the pharmacies, the stockouts on the shelves, but I want to draw your attention to another crisis of which we've heard about today and yesterday. And if you were in Reykjavik, Iceland, in October 2008, your television programming would have been interrupted with this man, Prime Minister Gerhard, with the letters in block white, "God bless Iceland." He was warning Icelanders of bankruptcy, of default, and a period of hardship not seen since World War II. And he had a point. For all of Iceland's biggest banks failed, its total debt rocketed to 800% of GDP, making it the worst banking crisis relative to the size of an economy in the history of financial crises. A country whose banking system squandered all of its assets would have trouble finding support, and like Greece, Iceland was forced to turn to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. And with it came usual strings, including to cut health by 30%. At a conference with health officials in Gastein, we took to joking, what's the difference between the IMF and a vampire? One stops sucking your blood after you're already dead. And faced with this prospect of deep cuts to their healthcare system, something quite unusual happened next. More than 10% of Icelanders took to Althingi House, Iceland's parliament, in protest. The equivalent in the UK would be 6 million people storming on their government central quarters, or in Greece, over 4 million. And the officials very clearly noticed the protests, for the health minister resigned, and the president of this tiny nation called for a radical solution, a democratic option. And in March 2010, 93% of Icelanders voted no to financing bank bailouts with deep cuts to their health and social protection systems. Summing up the program, as we heard yesterday, the president of Iceland said, "We were wise enough not to follow the prevailing orthodoxies of the Western financial world over the past 30 years. We let banks fail, we instituted capital controls, and we didn't introduce austerity measures you're seeing here in Europe." And what happened as a result? Thanks to increasing and allowing automatic stabilizers to work, there was no sign of people losing access to health care in Iceland. Unemployed persons in Greece and the UK, so commonly seen to report being stressed, anxious, having double the risk of suicide, wasn't seen in Iceland. Instead, people who lost jobs reported sleeping more and spending more time with their kids and families. There was no rise in depression or suicide. Often, we see diets take a turn for the worst as people to save money buy cheap, unhealthy foods. But in Iceland, McDonald's pulled out of the country, citing operational difficulties. Apparently, importing tomatoes was the most expensive part of McDonald's burgers. I hadn't realized there were tomatoes in McDonald's burgers. But instead, people turned to locally sourced fish, one of the main sectors that's helped drive Iceland's recovery. And to top it all, Iceland, once rated as the world's happiest nation, in 2011, in the middle of the worst banking crisis in history, was again, by the first UN World Happiness Report, rated as one of the world's happiest nations. Now, of course, Greece and Iceland are two extremes, very different nations, and Iceland, sitting outside the Eurozone, had options to devalue its currency and boost its exports. But the contrast proves that an economic crisis in and of itself, with associated rises in unemployment, homelessness, and debt, need not lead to a public health disaster if politicians take steps to protect their people. Fiscal policy is a matter of life and death. To further test this hypothesis, we've looked at historical cases. I don't have so much time, but I want to briefly share two important ones. And one was the Great Depression in the United States, commonly invoked to give insights on how to respond to this crisis. And what may come as a surprise to those of you who learned about the Great Depression through images of bankers jumping out of windows is to know that even though suicide rates did fall, overall mortality, as depicted here, overall mortality in the United States fell, coinciding with the Depression. Now, it was a period where there was a lot going on, and as we drilled into the data, we learned what drove this association was road traffic deaths dropped. Road safety was a foreign concept at the time, and people, to save money on fuel, turned to walking rather than driving. But what was more important as a buffer to people had to do with a debate about how to deal with the crisis. And the incumbent president, Herbert Hoover, who argued people should pick themselves up from their bootstraps, was viewed as a little out of touch at the time. And Franklin Roosevelt campaigned, pledging the American people to a New Deal, to put people back to work, to build new homes, build new schools and hospitals, and he won. But it created a natural experiment worth evaluating, for some governors in the US sought to avert the New Deal, while others, who were left-leaning, sought to go even further than Roosevelt's plan. And this led to a lasting polarization in health across US states, where we found that each additional $100 per capita injection of stimulus into building public infrastructure, schools, and hospitals led to lasting reductions in infant mortality, pneumonias, child deaths, and even suicides. A second crisis to draw your attention to is one that presents a warning to Greece. This is the Asian financial crisis. I won't go into too much detail, but Thailand, in the middle of a crisis, turned to the International Monetary Fund for help, and with it signed up to, much like Greece, a 50% cut in its HIV prevention budget. That marked a turning point in Thailand's history of infectious disease trends, here depicting pneumonia, TB, and HIV deaths, which are interrelated, from which Thailand is only just now recovering. Neighboring countries, Malaysia, that didn't borrow from the IMF and instead expanded their HIV prevention programs, continued on the path they had followed. It was only in December 2012 that the International Monetary Fund apologized to Thailand, noting that the harms of austerity and its liberalization recommendations were 3 times greater than previously assumed. And this is a trend that we've seen with recently the IMF in a paper entitled Growth Forecast Errors and Fiscal Multipliers, apologizing to Greece, noting, in the words of the chief economist, we underestimated the negative effect of austerity on employment and spending power. Now, this fiscal multiplier, a bit of an obscure statistic, goes right to the heart of the debate because it describes the effect of each euro of government spending on economic growth. And when that number is less than 1, it means you would have expansionary austerity. You would help power recovery by cutting. The IMF had assumed it was 0.5, but when it took a first look at the hard data from this recession, found it was much bigger, above 1, ranging between 0.9 and 1.7. But there was a big assumption in this debate, one that I hope our students at Oxford wouldn't make, and that's all government spending affects the economy equal, which is clearly implausible. We wouldn't expect defense and education, the environment, and health to have the same effects on the economy. So we took the IMF's method and we extended it to look at different components of government spending. And in a paper hot off the press, what we found is that health, education, and social protection had some of the biggest and most positive fiscal multipliers, up to 3 euros for each euro invested, putting money into already overstretched systems that rapidly translated into jobs while providing valuable services that protect the nation's health. In contrast, we found bailouts and defense spending, often in Europe, led to trade deficits, as money flowed out of the economy to foreign contractors or ended up in offshore tax havens. And this is a pattern that manifests in the data that those countries pursuing greater government investment into this recession have had faster recoveries. Here I have on the x-axis change in GDP, government spending per capita, and the y, change in GDP. You can see Greece at the bottom left, but at the top right you can see some of the fastest recoveries with more spending. Finland, Sweden, and Germany. Germany preaches the virtues of austerity for others. So there is an alternative, and one that has its roots not just in the present, but history. I have here a quote from Nye Bevan in the UK, a personal hero of mine, in 1948 saying that despite our financial and economic anxieties, we're still able to do the most civilized thing, put the welfare of the sick in front of every other consideration. He was speaking at a time when Britain's economy was in shambles. Its total debt was 400% of GDP, a figure far higher than today. And he was speaking at a time when he founded the National Health Service, at a time when universal child benefits were introduced. And this massive stimulus package in the face of debt and economic decay didn't break the bank. Instead, it helped pave the way for peace in Europe, as we've heard, but also the year the NHS was founded was a turning point in the history of British debt. Within a decade, it had fallen in half, and it was only in 1980 that we began to see the upward march in debt as a fraction of GDP that led us to the situation we're in today. So in closing, so I can see Nikos giving me the eye, our plan for Europe builds on what we've learned from this recession. It builds on what we've learned from the Great Depression and the New Deal, the Marshall Plan that helped Germany to recover, and Bevan and the attack on 5 giants in the UK, all which invested wisely in recession. So call this plan a New Deal. And at its core are three guiding principles. The first is do no harm. This ancient law of higher healing should guide our fiscal policy. Had austerity been run like a drug trial with a board of ethics, it would have been stopped, given evidence of its harm and the failure of its purported benefits to accrue. We've requested the European Commission fulfill its treaty obligation to evaluate the health impacts of its policies. We made that request in 2008, and we're still waiting. Second, we should treat unemployment like the pandemic it is, a leading cause of alcoholism, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, heart attacks, to name a few. What we've learned is that smart investments in truly active labor market programs that provide people with caseworkers, an action plan, and support to help return to work can not only prevent depression and suicides, but also save money on healthcare bills and employment checks. At a time when jobs are scarce, there's a need to go even further to create jobs. Finally, invest in public health. New York City officials learned the hard way, the age-old cliche that prevention is better than the cure, when in their 1970s fiscal crisis, they cut tuberculosis prevention budgets by about $100 million. Only 3 years later, to have a drug-resistant TB crisis that cost more than $1 billion to control. Austerity in health is a false economy. The irony is that the epidemics Greece is now in the grip of, HIV, TB, malaria, drug resistance on hospital wards, are going to cost much more to control than they would be to prevent. Investing in health is a wise choice in good times and an urgent necessity in the worst of times. Finally, a shameless bit of self-advertising. The body economic goes into much more detail. Thanks for sticking with us.
Thank you, David, for your nice presentation and your warm speech.